Good morning. I am Marie Harf, the Executive Director at Perry Worldhouse at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you all for joining. This is the second week in a row we've had a Friday morning rapid response event about the Iran-Israel war. And 2 weeks after Israel began its strikes and a week after the U.S. joined that effort with strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, we are very lucky. I feel very personally lucky to be joined by two leading experts, really extraordinary folks today on this webinar to talk through some of the key issues that we're facing today. Again, 2 weeks from the start of the war. We'll have a conversation to start, but we want to take as many of your questions as possible. So please put them in the chat as you think of them, and I will get to them throughout this conversation. So first, I will introduce our panelists. Jeffrey Lewis, who is an expert in nuclear nonproliferation and geopolitics. He is really a giant in this field. I'm not trying to embarrass you here, but as someone who's worked on these issues for a couple decades, he is a professor at Middlebury Institute of International Studies. He runs their East Asian Nonproliferation Program, also runs the leading blog on disarmament called Arms Control Wonk. You can find him on social media at that hashtag, or at that handle, I should say, and does extraordinary work on nonproliferation issues around the world. So please follow him and check out his work. We're also joined by Barak Ravid, who is an award-winning journalist. He is the foreign policy correspondent for Axios and a global affairs analyst at CNN. I'm sure many of you have seen him on TV many times. He has deep sourcing in Israel and the Israeli government. And I should say, he also has a relatively new book on the Abraham Accords. You can find it on Amazon and other places. That includes in-depth interviews with President Trump and a number of other folks that were involved in the Abraham Accords. And as a personal point, I got to know Barak when he was covering the Iran talks that I was working on the government side, and he was covering them for Haaretz. So both of these experts have worked on the Iran nuclear profile for quite a long time. So very happy to have both of you here. Jeffrey, I'm going to start with you on the nuclear question. There is a lot of spin, not to make a pun, not to make a centrifuge pun for you at 10 a.m. on a Friday. There's been a lot of spin out there about what was actually destroyed and the state of Iran's nuclear program today. The U.S. Administration has been briefing. They briefed senators yesterday. They're briefing the House today. Unsurprisingly, members of different parties came out of that briefing yesterday saying different things about Iran's nuclear program, about the stockpile of highly enriched uranium that already exists, about the centrifuges, and about the future capabilities of that program and how long it might take Iran to rebuild some of these things. So can you set the stage? What actually did the U.S. do with those strikes, and where is Iran's nuclear program to the best of your knowledge today?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's the question I spend pretty much all day, every day thinking about right now. I think the first thing to say is the Iranian nuclear program prior to the two sets of strikes was very large and is very old. And it emerged from a weapons program in the 2000s and then became a much bigger thing over the last 20 years. I say all of that to say that what I think the simplest kind of summary of it is that Israel destroyed almost all of the things that we know about that are above ground. The United States came in because Israel could not destroy things underground very effectively, in my opinion. And the United States targeted the Fordo fuel enrichment plant, which is very deeply underground, and the enrichment halls at Natanz, which are not so deeply underground. That part of the program, I think, is very severely damaged. At the same time, there are many other underground facilities that were simply not struck. We could talk about those at some length, but there are at least 3 or 4 important ones that I think you can't say the program is obliterated unless those things go. And then, of course, there's the question of the things we don't know about. Iran had a covert nuclear weapons program until 2003. The U.S. intelligence community said that was suspended. I tend to find that very compelling. The whole point of the Iran nuclear deal was to keep it suspended and to keep it monitored. But there is always the risk that there are places that we don't know about. So great job on the stuff that we know about that's above ground, but that's, at best, maybe, half, two-thirds the program. And that still leaves them, I think, with a lot of capability.
A quick follow-up before I go to Barak on this, because you've been doing some good reporting on Israeli intelligence assessments about this as well. Those facilities that remain underground that were not struck, are those enrichment facilities? Do we know if that's where some of the already enriched uranium is? If they were to sort of make a strategic decision to rush forward for a bomb, which is one of the options that they could realistically take right now, how long would that take, and how do those facilities play into this?
Yeah, I'll take answer D, all of the above.
Okay.
The facilities that are outstanding. First of all, there is a facility under. Sometimes a lot of this gets confusing because these things are located near one another, and we use the same place name for them. And so, if somebody blows up a building at Natanz, people get the idea that everything at Natanz was blown up. Or if I say they blew up an underground facility at Natanz, they think all the underground facilities were blown up, but that's not true. So near Natanz, there's a place called Pickaxe Mountain. I'm not going to try it in Farsi. That is a giant underground complex that is much deeper than Fordo, that the Iranians started digging after the Israelis had sabotaged some centrifuge production workshops. And that houses a centrifuge production line. So that's a place where Iran has the ability to make new centrifuges to replace the ones that were destroyed. At the uranium conversion facility near Isfahan, there are some very large tunnels. That's probably where most of Iran's stockpile of HEU was stored. The entrances to those facilities were, I would sort of describe as lightly struck, but the actual underground tunnels themselves were not attacked. And then Iran, the day before the war, and this has somehow been lost, told the IAEA that they have a new enrichment facility. It's not operating. They said it was completed, but that they were going to start installing centrifuges. That's located somewhere in the Isfahan area. Based on commercial satellite imagery and some reporting that others have done, it's clear that facility wasn't struck. And then finally, there's another facility that Iran had built before 2003 as part of its covert weapons program, where they would have taken the enriched uranium and they would have turned it into metal, and then they would have fashioned it into nuclear weapons. Iran never put that facility into operation, but it exists. It is built, it is completed, it is sitting in a place called Parchin, and it was not struck. So, if you want a small nuclear weapons program, like one viable route is to start with a really big nuclear energy program and let the US and Israel bomb it into a small weapons program. And that's sort of where I would say we are. They still, I think, again, have a significant amount of capability.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That does not sound like it was obliterated. And that's also not a term that military or intelligence bomb damage assessors would ever use. Having worked in the intelligence community, that is not a technical term. Barak, there is no journalist I think I know that has better sourcing inside Israel than you do. And inside the Israeli government, the Israeli military, the intelligence services. You've been on CNN this week talking about some of their assessments of how much damage has been done to Iran's program. Can you give us a sense for how the Israelis are viewing this campaign and how successful it's been?
Hi, Marie. Thank you for having me here. It is quite astonishing that when I think about our time in Vienna and Lausanne and Geneva and all those places more than a decade ago, and that, I don't, I remember that this was like the possibility of a strike on Iran was, on the table for more than a decade. And I don't know if I never thought it would happen, but, it was still something that was always like a very remote scenario. And it's amazing to see that, where we are now after 2 weeks of war. And I think that in the debate, especially in America, the media debate and the political debate, how we are sort of in a weird place that it's an all or nothing debate. It's either if it was obliterated or nothing happened, total failure. When the reality is in the middle. Maybe not even in the middle. The reality is, let's say if obliterated is 10 and nothing happened is 0, I think we're somewhere between 6 and 7. And I think that it's not, if you look at everything that's been done, that's not a bad outcome. Especially that one of the things that, putting the technical issues aside for a minute, geopolitically, the idea was, or the claim was for years, that an attack on Iran's nuclear program, either by Israel or the U.S., would lead to a catastrophe, a regional war. Everything in the world will blow up. The Iranians will do X, Y, Z. At least for now, it's not the case. Okay, part of it is because it happened after a regional war, so all the capabilities that Iran had to deter or to respond were non-existent anymore. And I think this was a main part in the decision to go for such an operation. It was much easier to take this decision both for Israel and the US when you know that Hezbollah has been degraded significantly, Hamas decimated almost completely, militias in Iraq are deterred, Assad regime collapsed, you have the Houthis, but it's not a big threat. So I think this is one thing that, to me at least, was astonishing, that this has happened, and the Iranians are basically, we discovered that the Iranians were a paper tiger, militarily, conventionally. I'm not talking about the nuclear side. About the nuclear side, I think the difference between how Israeli intelligence assess the things and how U.S. intelligence assesses things is that U.S. intelligence focused on the results, mostly on the results of the U.S. strike, and not on everything as a whole. That's number one. And number two, I think it was mostly about, okay, what did we hit and what was destroyed as a result of this hit? When Israeli intelligence looked at things much more holistically and said, okay, before the war, Iran had an industrial scale enrichment program. They had industrial scale centrifuge production lines. They had vast know-how of scientists who knew how to make a nuclear bomb. They had labs and facilities for conducting R&D on a possible weaponization. They had a plutonium, potential plutonium reactor. They had uranium reprocessing facilities, and it can go on and on and on and on. When you look at the results of everything that happened, the Israeli strikes and the US strikes, you see that most of that is gone. From the leading scientists, the A list and B list of Iranian scientists who know how to make a bomb are dead. Iran's above ground and underground facilities in Natanz are gone. They can obviously always be rebuilt, but they're gone. The centrifuges are gone. Isfahan reprocessing facility that is, sort of a bottleneck for creating a nuclear bomb is gone. Fordo got hit. According to Israeli officials, Israeli intelligence shows that the damages to the facility were also inside. They claimed there were internal collapses inside the facility, which basically means that there's high likelihood that the centrifuges that were there cannot be operated again. It's a very sensitive machine. If you have such a shock wave inside the facility, then most likely they were destroyed. Israel destroyed many of the centrifuge production lines, so it's not impossible to rebuild them, but it will take time. And the stockpile, according to Israeli officials, the stockpile of 60% enriched uranium and also 20% enriched uranium that were mostly stored in Fordo and in the Isfahan tunnels are, the way it was described to me, are sort of sealed off from the outside world. And it doesn't mean that the Iranians cannot dig and get there. They can, but the Israelis are confident that they'll see such an effort. And more than everything, in order to rebuild the program and relaunch the program, there needs to be a decision to do it. And one of the things that, each country is different, but according to the way the Israelis see it, they bombed the Iraqi nuclear program, and it was never really rebuilt, or there was never, a similar effort by the Iraqi government to, get nuclear weapons after the strike on the reactor in the 1980s. Iraq never became again a threat for producing nuclear weapon, regardless of what some people said years after. Syria, also, Assad built a reactor with the goal of building nuclear weapons through a plutonium path. It was never rebuilt after Israel struck. Iran is not Iraq. Iran is not Syria. Programs are different. Each country is different, okay? But what is similar is the way leaders think and the way countries behave. There are similarities between countries. And Iran spent hundreds of billions of dollars on this nuclear program. And on the one hand, there's one analysis says because they did all that, they will never give up on it. They'll just rebuild it. It's part of their national ethos. But there are others who think that to restart such an effort right now with the situation Iran is in, with the way the regime is, with the way that you have a supreme leader who's hiding in a bunker and wants his regime to continue functioning and to have some sort of a succession process. It's not an easy decision to say, all right, from Monday morning, everybody come back to work, let's rebuild it. And that's why the Israelis think when you put all of this together, they think that the Iranian nuclear program and or Iran's ability to build a nuclear weapon was set back by between 1 and 2 years.
Thank you for that. It also takes money to rebuild.
Exactly.
And Iran, not just a political decision and will, but it does. And Iran does not have unlimited access to funds. Although we do know that when they have a choice about what to spend it on, they often do spend it on this. To both Jeffrey and Barak, clearly a lot of damage was done, and we can find some middle ground between the American assessment and the Israeli assessment and what experts here, outside experts are looking at. What has been interesting to me, and look, I agree with you. When we were sitting at the Iran talks, the idea that we would actually bomb Iran seemed fantastical. I mean, we made very clear to them that we had the weapons to do so, right? Barack Obama said, we built the mop. We have it. We will use it. But what's so interesting to me now is everyone from J.D. Vance to Donald Trump to other Republicans are saying we can debate about how much we set the program back, but there's still a need for further negotiations. And I'd love both of you to weigh in on this. It's a little frustrating for me because for a long time, people on that side of the aisle would say, we need to bomb, we need to bomb. You can never trust Iran to negotiate over their program. And now there's a little bit of revisionism, I think, going on and saying, well, yes, the bombing was intended to do a lot of harm to it, but we still need to negotiate. Negotiate over what? What does that look like? Are the Iranians even interested in that? So, Jeffrey, maybe respond to some of what Barak said, but also that idea that now, people who didn't think we could ever negotiate with Iran have suddenly found themselves in a place saying, oh, this was always intended to be temporary. I mean, that's just not true. That's not what they said. But it's an interesting dynamic that we found ourselves in now. You're on mute also, Jeffrey.
Yes. Well, so there's a lot there to unpack. I think the first thing I would say is that we don't really know how Iran is going to respond to this strike. It is true, for example, that Syria, when it was bombed, does not appear to have had the capacity to reconstitute its nuclear program. That's not true about Iraq in the 1980s. After the Israelis bombed the Osirak reactor, Iraq invested very heavily in a centrifuge program that had made a surprising amount of progress. Saddam Hussein's mistake was to invade Kuwait before that program had come to fruition. So, I think what you have there is actually a nice pair of case studies, one in which you have a leader who gives up and one in which you have a leader who becomes determined. And which of these will the Iranian leadership be? And I think the answer is we don't know. I think what I would say about negotiations is, when I look at what was struck, I do not think that the purpose of this strike fundamentally was to eliminate the nuclear weapons program. I understand that was a minor goal or a part of the overall strike, but I can't emphasize this enough. The day before the bombing, Iran announced it had a new enrichment plant that they are going to begin installing centrifuges in. That was not struck. So, if we say, well, they got 60% or 70%, there are some areas of life where 60 or 70% of the stuff is great, right? That's a big outcome to get. If it's enrichment facilities leaving a third of the nuclear program in place, I think is kind of a failure. It's a terrible outcome, right? Now, that still requires the Iranians to want to do this, right? And so what we don't know is how they're going to respond. I know the Trump people think that the Iranians are going to come back to the table. That's a possibility. It is also possible that the Iranians will simply complete the nuclear weapon. And, we're already seeing, I think, some worrying signs in this regard. The Iranian parliament has passed a bill suspending cooperation with the IAEA. So I think we're going to have drastically reduced, visibility into what the Iranians are choosing to do. But we don't really know, right? I mean, I think at the end of the day, whatever decision Iran makes probably won't be the kind of things that, you might think about strategically. It's going to have a lot to do with their own internal politics, questions of succession. And I just, for the moment, I can't see into that. But I do think that, my read on this was a big gamble on regime change, hoping that the regime would fall, hoping that the U.S. would get involved. That, really didn't pay off. And so now we're left with a weakened, but potentially very hostile government that, still has a substantial nuclear capability.
Barak, I'm curious, how does Prime Minister Netanyahu feel about, where does he think this should go from here? Does he actually think there should be another round of negotiations that the kind President Trump has talked about? How does he feel about the ceasefire right now? I mean, you're exactly right. There were a lot of us who said if military action happened, it would start World War III. And a lot of Americans would be killed and a lot of Israelis would be killed. And because it came on the heels of months of Israel's extraordinary success against Iran and its proxies, that didn't happen. So how is Bibi looking at, a return to negotiations, or does he think the ceasefire is durable? Or if he sees Iran doing some of the things Jeffrey talks about, do you think that he would restart the war? Where is his head right now on this?
So, as you know, Marie, Netanyahu knows very well how to start things. He has a more difficult time to finish or close crisis. That was always been his problem. And it's the same thing here. I just want to say it's shortly, I think that even though I don't think what happened is a failure. I think even though the current situation post the war is not perfect, it's not 100%, anyone who read the IAEA reports that were published 24 hours before the war, I think those reports are under the definition of terrible. And I think that I don't think it's at least you know what, we can always argue about everything, but I think that the situation, the threat from Iran's nuclear program has decreased in comparison to what was described in those two IAEA reports. And with all due respect to the legislation passed by Iran's parliament about cooperation with the IAEA said in its report 24 hours before the war that it does not get cooperation from Iran, that Iran hasn't come clean on all sorts of issues, that it did not give sufficient information about undeclared material and several undeclared sites. So, I mean, it's to say that now Iran will not cooperate with the IAEA, like, give me a break. It's a country that did not cooperate with the IAEA for several years now, since the assassination of Muhsin Fakhrizadeh in, it was 2020 or 2020 or 2021 or can't remember, like during the transition between Trump and Biden. And afterwards, the Iranian parliament started, escalating the nuclear program and decreasing its cooperation with the IAEA, and it's been a one-way street since then. So that's about that. About the Netanyahu was never a fan of nuclear deals with Iran.
I do remember that.
Yes, I'm sure you remember his meeting with John Kerry at the airport. Something I will never forget in 2015. Really, I will never forget that meeting. How Netanyahu just lost it in front of the cameras, and so he was never a fan of nuclear deals with Iran. I don't think that the war has changed that. What Netanyahu said publicly is that if Iran will try to reconstitute its nuclear program, Israel will attack again. Vice President Vance and President Trump said the same thing, that if Iran will try rebuilding its nuclear program, the U.S. will strike again. And I don't think they're bluffing. I think Netanyahu is also in this fantasy that if Iran will rebuild its ballistic missile program or it will rebuild its air defenses, Israel will also strike again. There's no chance that the U.S. will allow him to do it. I see very little chance of that. Trump is done with this war unless Iran, starts rebuilding its nuclear program, and I think the Iranians know that. And the big question is now, in my mind, what's going to happen in the negotiations. I think there could be negotiations next week. By the way, an interesting anecdote and a trivia detail that not a lot of people know. The Israelis promised the US that they will attack only after the sixth round of talks with Iran will result in a failure. Okay, the sixth round of talks was supposed to take place, according to the US and to the Omani mediators, on June 15th. And it was publicly announced. But on June 12th, both Israel, and therefore Israel's plan was, it will happen on June 15th, it will be clear that Iran said no, and then we will go ahead. But on June 12th, according to Israeli and US officials, there has been new intelligence that showed that the Iranians are not going to show up for the June 15th meeting. And at that moment, the Israelis spoke to the U.S., to the White House, and said, "You see the same intel we see. They're not gonna show up, so we got nothing to wait for. So we're going for it." And I think that now we'll have to see whether the Iranians come back to the table. I think they will. I think their public statements by President Pezeshkian and Foreign Minister Arakchi show that they will go back to the table. And there are a lot of things to discuss. I think when it comes to President Trump, if the Iranians want to know what they can get, I think they need to look at Syria. And I think that there is a willingness in the White House to basically take the same road they took with Syria, to basically say, all right, if you're going to do what we ask you, all sanctions are off immediately, not in this gradual pace like in the JCPOA. And I think that's what Trump is willing to do, to basically say, all right, no sanctions anymore.
It's interesting. There have been leaks about what the Trump administration is willing to do that look very, I mean, it could be like that. I think they feel very confident in what they did in Syria. And I think it's a playbook they like. But a lot of the leaks about the deal that the Trump administration is thinking about is basically the JCPOA. With the main question of continued enrichment. And look, I do think the Iranians miscalculated on Trump and Bibi, and Prime Minister Netanyahu. 60 days in, I think, the Iranian negotiators' mind was just a starting point. These things take years, they take months. And I do think they expanded their program so quickly and did not think that 60 days was an actual deadline. We're getting some questions in the chat, so I'm going to go to them. Someone wrote, this might be a question for Dr. Lewis, but either of you can answer. I read your thread on Twitter, an article in Foreign Policy on how Israel's goal might be regime change. I noticed through geolocations of some strikes that it seems some Israeli strikes had targeted political institutions that would be used as, quote, repressive measures against the Iranian people. Do either of you think such strikes are made to ease the way for the potential of regime change, perhaps from within Iran itself? So either of you can weigh in on that.
Yeah, I mean, let me start by, boy, there's really a lot that I want to say. But I guess
say it all. You have the floor, Jeffrey.
Well, no, I mean, there's a lot I want to say about that. There's a lot I want to say about, how we got where we are. But, I think the simplest way to say this is that the Israeli strikes, when you look at them by volume, they were largely focused on decapitation and leadership targets. They were secondarily focused on attriting the ballistic missile force that would retaliate. And it was clear to me that nuclear sites were the third priority. And again, I mean, it's wild to me as somebody who looks at satellite images, there are just facilities that weren't struck. And when I would ask about them, I'd be told like, well, the U.S. is going to come get them, or, oh, well, there will be commando raids, later. I mean, I think the Israelis are they're great planners. I mean, this was an incredible operation. They know what they can destroy and they know what they can't destroy. And they know that they're leaving in place a substantial nuclear capability. So having said that, well, then what is the play? And I observe they named the operation Rising Lion, which is the lion is the symbol of pre-revolutionary Iran. It's not counter-proliferation gazelle, right? The gazelle is Israel's national animal. Just, sort of Israel, much fiercer than a gazelle, but okay. So, I really do think when you just look at where they chose, that's really, I think, what the hope was. And Netanyahu gave a speech the second day of the war saying that the strikes were, in his words, were clearing the pathway for the Iranian people to rise up. So, I think if you just look at this kind of coldly, I mean, that you can't go get everything, right? And particularly now, as we're seeing with Fordo, even Fordo was kind of an edge case for the biggest U.S. munitions. So you're going to leave some capability in place. And as you say, Marie, you've never been interested in a deal in the first place, right? There's no deal that you like. In fact, you sort of like the nuclear problem because it is an excuse to keep all those sanctions on. I think if Donald Trump came back with a deal with Iran where all the sanctions came off immediately, but left the Islamic Republic in place, I think that would drive Netanyahu crazy, right? If money started flooding into Iran. So, I really do think that the fundamental strategic calculation was that this is a decapitation strike against the leadership. Hopefully the regime will fall. Maybe you'll get the U.S. dragged in to do that job. And the strikes in the nuclear program are about creating a public willingness and providing a very thin patina of legal justification so that you can present this as a preemptive act of self-defense rather than what it is, which is I think, again, unsuccessful effort at regime change.
Jeffrey, just so that you know, and our other people that are on this webinar will know, the name of the operation was taken from the Bible, Numbers 23:24. I can read you the quote if you want. It's not because of pro-revolutionary lions in Iran.
You don't think that there was a double meaning they were winking and nodding at? Because
I'm
I will
sorry.
say,
It's,
Do
The
I look
Iranian
that stupid?
diaspora,
you know,
Ross, the Iranian
I don't know.
diaspora
I don't know
read
if you
it
look
that
stupid
way.
or not. I'm just responding to what you said.
Yeah.
I'm responding to what you said, not to how you look. And
I mean, I know what the Israelis said the thing is. My job as an academic is to
as a
call
journalist,
BS when I see it.
as a journalist, I try to get the facts and stay away from conspiracy theories. I think that's best also in other professions in life. And about regime change, does Bibi want regime change in Iran? Obviously, that was his wet dream for 4 decades. There's no doubt about it. He spoke about it, I don't know, 10 million times. He spoke about it during the war. He said publicly that regime change in Iran could be a result of this war. The Israeli military struck several targets that were all, and they said it publicly, they were all intended to destabilize the regime and weaken the regime. Still, is this, but at the same time, there was never, the regime change was never, an official directive or goal that was approved by the Israeli cabinet. And from talking to IDF officials, they were never told in any meeting or by the political leadership that that's where we're going. At the same time, did Bibi hope that this would lead to an uprising in Iran? Of course he did, but that's the same person who thought that people don't wear jeans in Iran. It's completely ludicrous, and it is clear, at least for now. Who knows what will happen next week, but at least for now, there's no evidence to suggest that the public support of the regime has weakened. If anything, this war led to a wave of nationalism in Iran, and people who hate this regime, including dissidents, found themselves, defending Iran against the Israeli attacks. If a person like Masih Alinejad finds herself writing posts condemning Netanyahu and Israel, I think it tells a lot about what are the chances that that this war would lead to regime change. And more than that, if there's one thing we see, is that the regime is cracking down much harder now on political opponents from within, and we see a lot of arrests. We see a lot of crackdown campaigns against alleged spies and agents. And so I think that what the regime is focusing on more than everything right now is to stabilize the situation and make sure that nobody even has a slightest idea of an uprising.
Well, and I will note the Supreme Leader released a video yesterday, and he is certainly not a young man, but he looked even more like this had taken a toll on him. And it's,
Yeah.
you know, it's hard to tell too much from a video, but I think that's an interesting question. A question for both of you. Jeffrey, I'll start with you from the chat. So the question is, I think Barak, you reported that military officials in Iran are not sending accurate information of the damage assessment to political leadership. Do you think this makes continuing the nuclear program more likely? I would actually add to that, and I love both of your thoughts on this. It's unclear that American intelligence is giving a full picture to President Trump. You can imagine, and my first 6 years in Washington, I spent at the CIA after Iraq WMD, right? When there was this really concerted effort to make sure we were giving the information as we saw it. I can imagine my colleagues sitting at Langley today hesitant about that on this and other issues, Russia, Ukraine, others. What is the impact that we've either seen through other case studies? I think Iraq is probably a good example, Jeffrey. And then I'll ask Barak to weigh in too on leadership that may not be getting accurate pictures about technical things like nuclear programs and how that impacts their decision making.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually extremely likely. It's easy to joke about with Trump, but I think we see it in a lot of authoritarian regimes where the leadership doesn't really want bad news, and the person who is the messenger for delivering bad news finds himself in a lot of trouble. And so it wouldn't surprise me that, I think one of the pieces of reporting involved the fact that there was signals intelligence. You're going to get a lot of, I think, confusing information because some people aren't going to know what's going on. Some people are going to know what's going on and not want to report it up. And so, yeah, I could definitely see the leadership being, fairly misinformed. I think when we look at particularly what we saw in Iraq after the 2003 war, Saddam had some idea of what was going on, but it was fairly attenuated through the fact that he executed people he didn't like. So I could definitely imagine a situation where people report back to the Supreme Leader things are great, and I can imagine the Supreme Leader believing that, and I can imagine the Supreme Leader making a decision based on that information. I think we just we don't really know what their information environment looks like, and to some extent I think that's true in every country. I mean, whenever we look at a historical decision-making case study, what you find is people have different opinions and different factual bases, often that don't hold up very well when you have the historical record, but they don't. And they often quite sincerely believe things that are, pretty wrong.
So, Barak, if you want to weigh in on that, I'm going to add to this another question from the chat that's related. What happens if Iran detonates a small nuclear weapon in an underground test? Like, what then? What do the Israelis do? What do the Americans do? Especially if they're not getting, depending on what information the Iranian leadership is getting.
So first about the previous question, one of the things that the Israelis saw in their intelligence is that Iranian military officials were calling political leadership on the phone saying, "Oh, I'm standing here right now, I'm looking at it, and it's all good, nothing happened." And they saw that the guy was not standing there. He was
like
standing in a different place.
Yeah.
So this was like it's an anecdote, but it's just to tell you that. I think, look, the challenges of relationships between politicians and intelligence agencies, I think it's something that has been, a challenge and a tension for hundreds of years, and it's going to continue. The question is whether intelligence officials will have a backbone. That's the question. I don't think that today in 2025 you can really really hide anything for a long time. So I think that even if there are intelligence assessments that people will try to hide, things come out. So I don't honestly, I don't think it's a major concern, mostly because you can't hide stuff like that these days. Like it's
Harder,
it's
certainly.
it's so it's so easy. I mean, it's so easy to just you don't even need to leak it to anybody. Like if you're an intelligence officer and you think that there's something wrong and you think that people are trying to shut you up. I mean, the possibilities today. I mean, we had like a few months ago an intelligence a CIA analyst who just put intelligence reports about Israeli preparations for an attack in Iran, just put it online on a Telegram channel. So I think the ability today to just like shut up everybody, and I'm not saying it's non-existent, but it's very, very hard to try and hide truth. Um, and about, I'm sorry, what was the
Well,
second?
maybe both of you can address what you think would happen. A, the
Oh,
likelihood that
yeah,
Iran detonates a small nuclear weapon in an underground test,
yeah.
and then what then? Maybe both of you
I
can speak to that.
I think that it would obviously create a huge, huge, huge international crisis, and it's um, it's something that would really change the whole region, in a sense that if Iran does it, then at least two other countries in the region, if not more, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, will do everything they can, everything to also do it as fast as possible. And then it's a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and God help us all.
Jeffrey, you're shaking your head like you agree. Let's also
Yeah,
remind our viewers that Israel has a nuclear weapons program as well.
I mean, I think one of the interesting questions is what are the contexts in which the Iranians would detonate a nuclear weapon? Because, uh, you know, Israel's nuclear arsenal does come with this. It's an implausible kind of deniability, but there is nonetheless a deniability which makes it politically possible for Israel's neighbors to accept this. We just don't talk about it. And so, if Iran moves to a situation where it has weapons, then the question is what causes it to disclose those weapons. If the Iranians do it out of the blue, that's one kind of set of scenarios. If it happens in the middle of a crisis where the Iranians, maybe like the South Africans, want to signal that they're now very, very close to using them, then that may be very different. But I just fundamentally agree. No matter what kind of outcome you're looking at, the pressure in Saudi Arabia and Turkey especially, and I think other countries that may have a little less capacity but no less desire, will be very, very strong. So this is a thing I would like to avoid. Although again I think it's more likely today than it was before the bombing.
I have one final question for each of you from the chat. So Jeffrey, I'll start with you. Does an Iranian nuclear program threaten the United States? We know it threatens Israel, but can you lay out the case for why or why not this would threaten U.S. such that we should do Israel's work for it? That is the question.
Right. Well, so it really comes down to what your model of the Iranian decision making is and how you think nuclear weapons might change them. The ways in which it is frightening is that until now, Iran has had an extraordinarily aggressive foreign policy. And if Iran were nuclear armed, it would feel, I think, much more confident that it could engage in that kind of violence abroad with no repercussions. Saddam Hussein was once asked, what would you get if you had a nuclear weapon? Would you use it on Israel? And he said no, but it would enable him to engage in all kinds of military attacks on Israel. I think the phrase he used was something like drown them in rivers of their own blood, which is like not great, right? So, I think from a U.S. perspective, we have a lot of interest in stability in the Middle East. We have interests around the world. Our foreign policy often disagrees very substantially with Iran. And so an Islamic Republic with a nuclear weapon, I think, would potentially feel very entitled to be much, much more aggressive than it has in the past. The best case scenario, and I'm not a person who really likes wishful thinking. It's, I think, probably one of the reasons I'm much more skeptical of this strike, is I feel like there's a lot of magical thinking going on about the outcomes. But I think there can also be magical thinking, like thinking it would be fine if Iran had a nuclear weapon because maybe they'll just, accept their deterrent and be happy. Maybe, but I certainly am of the view that if they had a nuclear weapon, they would become much more aggressive, or at least there's a very big risk of that. And the natural counter to that would then be that their neighbors would feel that they need the same capability. So again, I really would like to avoid all of this.
Barak, I have a two-part question to finish for you. So number one, what do you think are the long-term economic and public opinion impacts of the multi-front war, especially on Israel's security? And second, the impact on Israel of a U.S. leadership that isn't necessarily interested in the material outcome of any of this, but is more focused on what politically looks good for the Trump administration. Two different questions, but.
First, I'll start from the end. I'm 20 years in this business, and if there's one thing I learned, that I don't want to say everybody because it's unfair, but the majority of politicians and leaders take decisions because of political considerations. Okay, I know it's a shocker, but it's not only Donald Trump who takes decisions because of political considerations, and therefore I sort of think that there's there's this underlying assumption that Donald Trump doesn't care about what really happened. This is all about his own ego politics. Is it also about his ego and the politics? Yes, but that's true too. Really, like I covered 5 U.S. presidents. I got to tell you, Barack Obama also took decisions because of ego and political considerations. Joe Biden also took decisions because of political considerations and ego and his legacy and what donors told them and and Bibi, yes, also, and also Yitzhak Rabin. It's not that this is why, that's politics, and I really, at least I did not cover any politician in senior leadership levels that took decisions purely 100% because of the merits. Okay.
There are gradations, though. There
What?
are gradations.
No,
There
no,
are gradations.
they are. I'm not saying. I'm just saying that there's this underlying assumptions. No, Donald Trump, that's only politics and ego, and others is only because of merit. No, there are always variations. For somebody it's 90-10, for somebody else it's 60-40, for somebody, but it's always there. And I think it's also hard to know in real time how much is which. I have to tell you, like, from my experience with Donald Trump, okay, in something about things in the first term, some of the things he did, which I thought were purely political, I learned in the aftermath that they were also political, but also about merits. And a lot of the things that people told me, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. No, he actually knew what he was talking about. Talking about things in the first term, like, annexation of the West Bank and things like that, which I was surprised, for example, how much Trump knew about the issue of annexation of the West Bank and West Bank settlements and things like that I thought he didn't care about and didn't know. So that's my experience in covering Donald Trump. About the effect of the multi-front war on Israel, the country is in bad shape. There's no doubt about it.
What does that mean? What do you mean by
this war has been going on for 2 years, almost 2 years. It will create, I think, a lost generation in many fields, in the economy, socially, internally in the country. Just so that you understand, there are thousands of Israelis who were seriously wounded in the war, meaning they lost a limb, they were in a coma, they got a head injury, stuff that will stay with them for life. Okay, you have tens of thousands of people who are going to have PTSD. It's in a small country. It's just the amount of investment by the government to rehabilitate all those people would be billions of dollars. And that's before you think, how do I get investments back in? How do I get people who left the country to come back? And by the way, the war did not end. There's a war in Gaza. Okay, just in the last month, 20 Israeli soldiers were killed in Gaza. Okay, hundreds of Palestinians, maybe close to 1,000. I'm not like, don't take my word about like the exact number, but a lot of people, okay, between hundreds and 1,000 were Palestinians were killed in Gaza. This is still happening every day, and it takes a toll on Israeli economy, Israeli society. This war did not turn Israel to a more popular country among Western democracies. Okay, it did not make it more popular in the Middle East. The war in Iran, I have to say, improved the situation a bit with some Arab countries that are much more happy about Israel at the moment. But overall, the country will have to go through years of rehabilitation. The political crisis in Israel did not decrease. There was, during the war with Iran, it was like 12 days of unity. But once the ceasefire was announced, literally, once the ceasefire was announced, the political crisis came back with full force. The main issue in the news in Israel today, you want to know what it is? It's not Iran, it's not Gaza, it's Bibi's trial.
On Monday, he's testifying, right?
On Monday, he's testifying again, yes. And he tried to convince the judges to cancel his court hearings in the next 2 weeks. They refused. So this is a country that entered the worst war in its history during its worst political crisis in history. And so it will take a long time to rebuild and rehabilitate. You know, without sounding too bleak, I'm not even sure it's possible. I'm not sure it's possible. I'm one of those who's very pessimistic about the future of the country. Very pessimistic. And I just don't see a way out. And it looks like one-way street to a future where it will be a country that is much more religious, much more Spartan, with, Israel has been in its worst war since 1948, and the government is trying to officially pass a law to exempt the constituents of the ruling coalition from serving in the military. I know it sounds insane what I just said, but that's the reality.
Mhm.
And it's going to happen. Okay, it's just a matter of time. It's going to happen. So when that's the case, you'll see how more and more Israelis who are, let's say, more secular or more liberal, you'll just see this exodus continue. In the last 2 years, more Israelis left the country than came back. And I really don't see how this trend changes in the foreseeable future.
I think, thank you for that. Quite, I think, meaningful set of observations. I think it's a good place to end this conversation to remind ourselves as we're talking about how to confront a nuclear security challenge, either with military action, with war, or diplomatically, something Jeffrey has worked on his career, you've worked on covering Barack, I have worked on in government. It's it's a helpful reminder, I should say, the costs of these wars on populations, whether it's the Israelis and the Palestinians, whether it's the Iranians, whether it's others, if we're talking about other conflicts. So I think we unfortunately are at time. We had some more questions we couldn't get to, but I just want to say thank you to Jeffrey and to Barack. I have admired and followed both of your work for years as I've worked on these issues, and I'm so grateful that you could have some time to share your expertise and thoughts with our community. When we're back in person, when this school year is on, we'll have both of you to Philadelphia and we can do it all again in person. But thank you both. I know you're both very busy. And so thank you for finding some time for our audience today.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.